It's a pleasure to be here, both to be back in CPR, because I no longer live here, except spiritually. It's also a pleasure because this is work that I've been involved in. There is no paper yet, so I am particularly interested in the reaction. And the question is India in a US-style Gilded Age? Do we care, and what is the reaction? I want to actually thank CPR's communication team for these great photographs of the Vanderbilt and Ambani mansions, which are products of the two Gilded Ages. Also to thank various people I've been discussing with. Pratap, Ashu Varshni was actually the one who actually got me to convert some idle talk into a presentation, and also especially Pranav, wherever he is, Siddhawi, for support. So these are the themes. First is that both Gilded Age India and Gilded Age US and India are on a path of rent extraction and rent sharing, which is generating extreme wealth concentration. There is a subsidiary theme which I will present, which is that for certain periods, this rent-sharing system can be functional in the sense of supporting dynamic growth. Then what I want to talk to, and you'll see why I got even more interested in this, is the reaction in the US was the progressive era. Pratap referred to muckraking, which was very important for the subsequent transition. So actually, I think even more interesting is the contrast between the progressive era and contemporary India, with the theme, the suggested theme, that India, in contrast to the progressive era, the reaction has not yet coalesced into an effective response. This, despite what I will present as an apparent paradox of a lot of progressive era type formal policies. So, bit of context. And I started looking at the growth rates. First interesting result is actually since...
Michael, can I just interrupt? Can you just say yes or no to this one?
Yes. The Indian growth, which is this, has actually been substantially faster than US growth in the equivalent period. Comparing for instance, the last one is India in the 2000 boom, the US in the 1910s. India has also had substantially less volatility. This is the US with this tremendous volatility. These are big financial crashes, which is actually a theme I will come to later in the talk. And this is India. So far, it looks pretty good. So why do we care? First, India is still substantially poorer, and I'd suggest there are major questions about India's long-run growth dynamics, and a concern that the concentrated wealth could both distort that very growth dynamics and corrupt the political system, and that now the social and political response may be inadequate. So first, India remains, this is India, substantially poorer than Gilded Age, the United States. This comes through here to 1910 and 2012. So India is still a very poor country compared with the US over a century ago. And secondly, most countries get stuck. Here is India, with this is actually the beginning of the fast growth period. Here are a couple of comparators. Mexico, much richer, got stuck. Indonesia got stuck. So the typical pattern of developing countries is they have periods of fast growth and get stuck, and the context, the implicit thesis, is that understanding these political economy dynamics are central to that interpretation. So let's go look a little bit at the US Gilded Age. First interesting fact is there was indeed absolutely massive private wealth creation, extraction, which was on the back of what I will call rent-thick sectors. Rent-thick sectors like mining, railways, lumber and land, finance, where it is easy to extract rents in through corporate structures and out of those into private wealth accumulation. And actually, when I looked at this for the US, I was struck. This is the listing of billionaires down to about, I think it's the top 20 odd. The level of wealth in today's prices actually dwarfs some of the current billionaire wealth now. It makes even Carlos Slim look relatively modest in his income, and the Ambanis on that. Second thing is this is totally dominated by rent-thick sectors for the truly wealthy. And this was a concern at the time. This is a classic image from about 1900. Standard Oil was the basis of the wealth of Rockefeller, the first actually dollar billionaire, who was the historically still the richest ever man, and the view within the United States that the creation of these monopoly, what they call trust structures, was strangling the overall economic growth of the system, even while it created massive private wealth accumulation. So what are the parallels? And for this talk, I'm just going to sketch from my reading of the economic history, and I'm not an economic historian, and what I found really interesting with some of the parallels. First, the massive private wealth expansion was, to a large extent, on the back of corporate expansion in both cases. It's not aristocratic wealth. Second, much of this is in rent-thick sectors, oil and gas, railroads very big in the United States, not in India because it's a government-owned company, other mining, steel. That, if you look at the history of railroads, which I found particularly interesting in a wonderful book by Richard White, this was deeply linked around connectivity between business and the state, between business and politicians, with the railroad buccaneers had this technical term which was friends. And friends, in their parlance, meant trusted contacts through the business political nexus that could be guaranteed to continue to deliver the goods. Next thing, land deals were part of the nexus, especially in the railroads, and it's very familiar here. And an important thesis of the latest round of economic history is those railroads, famous for opening up the West, transformative of the US economy and eventually society, were incredibly inefficient. There's a huge amount of extracted resources from the government, and especially from raising borrowed resources, that were very inefficient. It could have been done at half the price. There was major environmental destruction as a consequence of the railroads, and substantial social costs. Social costs reflected, as everybody knows, with the major costs on the indigenous population, but also major social costs within the workforce, and particularly dramatically racist abuse of Chinese labor. Racist abuse both by the owners and by the people of European extraction. Let's look at India's billionaires. Some of you may have seen this slide before, that an interesting feature of the post-liberalization period is a tremendous rise in not only the rupee and dollar size of billionaire wealth, but that in relation to GDP. It rose to a peak at the end of the 2000 boom, with the stock market boom, fell down with the adjustment post-Lehman's, has gone up and down, is actually going up again now. Moreover, India is unusual in this respect. If you look at the ratio of billionaire wealth to GDP, India has unusually high billionaire wealth to GDP in relation to its income. So this has emerged at a relatively low level of income. It's of course gone a bit higher now. This is 2014, but I only did the 2015. This is 2015, it's about here now, but I haven't done the 2015 numbers for all the numbers. So it's comparable with Mexico, which is of course infamous for not only Carlos Slim, but the centrality of a whole group of billionaires whose wealth was very much created by state business connectivity, and with major concerns about the inefficiency of that for Mexico's dynamic. Moreover, within India, at least in certain periods, there's been a big concentration in so-called rent-thick sectors. And by this I mean real estate, construction, telecoms, infrastructure, finance, steel, liquor and mining. This is something that I was working on with Aditya Gandhi, but The Economist picked up and extended this proxy definition, and I actually used their categorization. So what's interesting is it started in the 90s with a major share of rent-thick sectors. This we see some of the IT and pharma boom. Then we see in the late 2000s rent-thick coming to dominate, and actually there's this interesting phenomenon of relatively less rent-thick sectors emerging in the last couple of years. And that's it in relation to GDP. Further comparisons. In the US, this was a learning for me, you see this tight interconnection between business and politics. Some of it was through the Friends system, and some of it, as in India, was actually through some of the major business tycoons moving in and out of politics. The Leyland Stanford, who is one of the group of 4 or 5 in the group that were in the central group on the Western railroads, is an interesting, he was, I think, governor of California, moved in and out of politics. One of the indicators of the inefficiency is even amongst the railroad community, he was considered to be pretty incompetent. So there's this wonderful irony that he, through his skills at connectivity, could extract substantial wealth. Then his legacy is Stanford, which has now become, from this somewhat incompetent rent-extracting individual, at the global nexus of productivity-based dynamism. And also in the US, the railroads effectively created the structured lobby system which has stayed with the United States ever since, and is very important to budgetary decisions and everything else, and now the increasing problem in the US of political finance corrupting economic and social policy. And of course, these are both resonant with India, but with deals and political finance at the core of the political relationship between business and politics here. There is, of course, as people quickly comment, a major contrast. Unlike the United States, India is in this period had widespread regulation under the license Raj, and sometimes called crony socialism, I think misnamed as more a mix of statism and connected capitalism. With examples of this, of course, is Dhirubhai Ambani was both adept at breaking into the regulatory Raj and managing that system, but also was central in terms of fostering a shareholding culture. So we see side by side the emergence of institutions of capitalism within this regulated system. And I'm going to come later to this idea of India having undertaken some institutional leapfrogging, of which the shareholder system is an example. Another contrast which I find very interesting is both India and the US, I suggest, display what you might call two faces of capitalism. There's the inefficient, connected, disruptive is not the appropriate word here, costly forms of wealth extraction, alongside elements of dynamic, competitive capitalism. US, of course, in this US in this period, this was the period where it actually was overtaking the United Kingdom and moving to defining the industrial technological frontier. And in India, some work I did with Ashok Modi and Nusha Nath a couple of years ago was looking at the full data on enterprises. And what we found there is that the way if you look at the whole enterprise system in India, it looked as if it was behaving like a broadly competitive enterprise system. So both sides exist side by side. However, in India, the tremendous surge in entry, which is a great driver of change in a system, started tailing off. And seemingly paradoxically, during the 2000s boom, there was very little entry in manufacturing. And there was a reconcentration. And in India, both state enterprises and the major conglomerates of business houses continue to dominate a lot of the corporate sector. Second parallel is, I suggest that both India and the United States exemplify what I would call aligned rent sharing, where these rent extracting and rent sharing structures also build genuine industrial capability. And of course, the US railways, while grossly inefficient, did create a centrally important capital stock. And we see in India some of the major conglomerates having the efficiency and capacity to go abroad, which is a measure of their underlying efficiency and capability. Quickly, I want to give, in a couple of places here, make this a little more concrete about how this has worked. And I'm going to use Andhra Pradesh. I presented some of this work a year ago. It's still ongoing, but I wanted to illustrate in the case of a state. So, Andhra Pradesh, central part of the political economic system, is the interrelationship between business, families, and politicians. A big part of the rent creation and the rent sharing came from construction, especially PPPs, as well as land deal, mining, and as you go down the system, liquor licenses. This, in Andhra Pradesh's phase, this is all pre-state separation, was driven through a hierarchy of initially local construction contracts around irrigation, increasingly to the major national level PPPs, and then through other mechanisms like mining licenses to international action. And what we see is a majority of the allotments for special economic zones, power generation, real estate projects were through PPPs. And I'm not going to go into the detail here, but a number of specific mechanisms whereby the land allocations to these PPPs led to effectively preferential treatment to the concessionaires, with often subsequent renegotiation that allowed them to extract excess value. At the head of the hierarchical structure of corporations were the two impressive corporations, GVK and GMR. And here there are some details of where they have headed up. These are now both national and global players, with, however, on the way, enormous debt accumulation. And part, I think, of the extractive story, and a particularly concerning part, is the connectivity has led to beneficiaries, corporate beneficiaries, extracting substantial debt out of the financial system, the heritage of which is this, what looks like a major debt overhang. And that is potentially a problem for both growth and the macroeconomy. And by the way, has affected the net worth. So the two owners of GVK and GMR used to be very much represented on the billionaire list, and their net wealth has actually gone down substantially. So unfortunately, they have now dropped off that list. You'll notice the Adani Group, which is even more salient now, also had very substantial debt accumulation in this period. I think there are mechanisms which I'll skip over now. We're looking at more detail of the particular mechanisms of how businessmen and politicians overlap. A little bit more on that later. So, on the one hand, in the Andhra Pradesh case, we see a case study of money being channeled in a very much rent extracting manner, but also creating major industrial capability, in this case in these construction companies. And this is a pattern that we saw very much in the United States. And in fact, one of the interpretations of the railroad companies was that the railroad companies created the corporate form in the United States, with a very important long-run consequences. And this is something we see in many of these companies around the United States, around India, with the concern that the rent-sharing dynamic undercuts the infrastructural, land and financial basis for dynamic growth through a variety of mechanisms. And the rent extracting opportunities can divert entrepreneurial effort, as well as what you might call the effort of development entrepreneurs in the public system, away from long-run productivity dynamics towards rent-thick sectors, with a further theme that for political viability, there has to be efficient social inclusion to manage the politics. So the thesis is a further political economic transition is necessary to avoid the middle income trap or some other configuration that will undercut development dynamics. Interestingly, and this is, I think, an interesting other part of the story, that some, and Fukuyama in his major new, certainly major in terms of size, political book, second volume of it, he argues that the transition from what he calls a clientelistic political economy, of which his categorization, India will be very much an example, the transition to a more effective, rules-based, institutionally grounded political economy is difficult and highly problematic unless there already exists an effective state and the effective rule of law. As an aside, because he would categorize Mexico, Italy, not to mention Greece, as explicit exemplars of a clientelistic polity that has its problems. As an aside, if India got to Mexico, let alone Italy, that would be pretty good. But to continue the thesis, in this big review of political economy transitions, the US is an exception. Because the US in the 19th century was a deeply clientelistic, patronage-based, rent-sharing democracy. It went through a transition which, as I'll a bit more later, was highly effective in creating an inclusive, dynamic political economy which sustained subsequent development. And it's one of the reasons I think it's so interesting for India is at a broad level, India is also needing to go through this transition from the basis of a democracy at a relatively low level of income and a fundamentally what they call clientelistic democracy. This is why the comparison with the progressive era comes next, is I think even more interesting than the Gilded Age comparison. So, little aside, but I think is relevant here, some earlier work that Pratap and I were involved in, is thinking how transitions occur in a simplified political economy. When there are structured inequalities. This leads to some kind of conflict, not necessarily violent conflict, but distributive conflict that needs to be resolved. And then there are alternative pathways. One pathway goes to efficiently regulated capitalism and some form of social democracy. Another pathway goes to a polity based on social patronage and some form of unbridled or crony capitalism, with the insights that the rent-sharing and populist path can be a functional political equilibrium for a sustained period. That's what I'm suggesting is typical of India in the past few decades and the United States in the Gilded Age period. It can deliver these significant phases of rapid growth and spending and some social benefits. But absent further political economic transformation, this gets stuck. It gets stuck in an equilibrium that has low productivity dynamics and distributive conflict which undercuts change. Back to the US. So I want now to give you a little vignette of what happened in the US. So first, over the decades, the lower and middle classes became wary is a rather polite way of saying they mobilized extreme anger around what they saw as big business. And interestingly, despite the fact that big business was interlinked with government, they actually turned to government in order to effect change as a counterweight. This was underpinned in the historians' telling by the deepening of democracy. The Australian Ballot, one person, one vote, apart from blacks, a significant reduction in clientelism. This says here, working citizens, do you want to win? Drop the old-fashioned methods of clientelism. Fight with the ballot. Is another contemporary cartoon. And this led to a really interesting multi-decade transformation. We can think of it, those of you who like Polanyi, as part of Polanyi's classic. He interpreted the double movement of a unregulated capitalism and a political social response, which led to either fascism or to social democracy. And what happened was a multi-decade but ultimately effective political social alliance between a range of popular movements. These are Granger's populists, progressives, antimonopoly movements, the reform movement in cities, the legislature, the executive. Teddy Roosevelt is famous, but there are also other key presidential executive action with a bridge too. The judiciary, which was interpreting or reinterpreting constitutional law, and of course with the antitrust law and Supreme Court interpretations central to that, and underpinned, yes, by muckraking journalism. And in the interpretation, it's the coalition between all these that put the political pressure on the system to change. And this led, I suggest, to a whole set of elements of a modern social democratic state. First, a major transition in the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy in the United States was totally based on favors. So just like Bolivia was certainly doing 15 years ago, when a new politician came in, brings all those people, usually his people, to take the bureaucratic positions, with something called the Pendleton Act, that was in principle professionalized, with a further very important transition where parts of the bureaucracy acquired what the historian Carpenter calls bureaucratic autonomy, the capacity to act independently of the political process, not to subvert it, to act independently, including building independent interest bases. A whole set of business regulation, rights and protections for workers, social protection, and in the cities, from machine politics to urban reform. This has been characterized as a grand bargain. A grand bargain because it was a bargain that saved capitalism. So that was this was preservative of capitalism, government supported business, and was effectively taking action to manage this excessive whole set of things, the Sherman Antitrust Act. Interestingly, that was 1890. This takes time. And then the actual trust didn't get busted 15, 20, 25 years later. The Pure Food and Drug Act to give consumer protection, the famous Glass-Steagall Act as protection against financial crises, Clayton Act, National Labour Relations Act, the minimum wage about protections for workers. And later, of course, the emergence of a broad-based social safety net, which interestingly, to go back to how I characterize the dynamics of the system, in both the United States and Scandinavia, the emergence of broad-based social security emerged out of intensive conflict. And what was striking about boring, monocultural Scandinavia is it's thick with conflict in the 1920s. And in the interpretation, that was what generated, in that case, the choice towards social democracy as opposed to the deep political economic choice towards fascism. And actually, the United States was ahead of the Nordics in unemployment insurance and social security in the mid-1930s. With the political scientist Swenson is extremely interesting in the interpretation in both domains that the major capitalists became important supporters of a social security system in the interest of not being undercut by the new entry and in the interest of economic and political stability. This was associated, along with education expansion, with what has become known in the United States as the Great Compression of this is top income shares, this is the peak of Gilded Age wealth, and we see this major reduction through to the 1940s with, as an aside, of course, a major increase since this is the big Piketty story, which is not the central part of today's talk, where, let me get it right, this is the United States, this is from Banerjee and Piketty, this one is India. So it's another prism on this rising income and wealth concentration in India. But I'm back to the progressive era. No, back to India now, sorry. So, how about India?
I think to go back to that picture of yours.
Yeah.
One more slide. The one before this. A lot of that secular declines which is concentrated in post-depression, pre- and post-war kind of history.
Oh. Part of saying a lot of the Great Compression occurred around the Great Depression and the war. And to oversimplify, there are two big stories here. One is the education technology dynamic, with the big expansion of education at decent quality, which has been politically driven from below, historically in the United States. The second is the destruction of concentrated capital by the combination of the Great Depression and the war.
And Piketty says the introduction of Scandinavian and egalitarian ideas roundabout where the transition takes place.
Yeah, very much. Yes, that's more the bulk of the population. But it took the war and the Great Depression to lead to the actual, for the 0.01% for that to come down. That doesn't happen often. So that's that story. So let's go to India. First, this is a point that Pratap made. He may or may not own it now, but think of two of the mega scams that have occurred in India. The 2G and coal. At one level, these look like classic cases of Gilded Age type connectivity, major rent extraction that benefit India's tycoons for a number of mechanisms. There was then, in an interesting way, part of India's formal accountability structure doing the muckraking. I'm not sure if CAG thinks of itself as a muckraker, but there was what I find interesting is that part of India's bureaucratic structure had sufficient autonomy to do technical work. That led to popular mobilization and a coalition around anti-corruption. There was then, that coalition was extended to influence the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, in alliance or in influence. And then we see an institutional innovation around auctions for both 2G and coal, allegedly with great transparency and greater efficiency, with possibly some questions around that. Now, at first sight, this looks like a full arc from Gilded Age concentration with mechanisms that parallel the US progressive era story to an institutional innovation. The thesis that I have is that despite this apparent full arc, the broader system remains stuck through a mixture of capture, hold-up, and populist political strategy, and that there lacks an effective coalition for change that will efficiently tackle the underlying distributive conflicts. But before getting to that, a really interesting feature of India, which I only really thought about when I started preparing for this, is there's been what looks like institutional leapfrogging. If you look what India has, those victories, hard-fought victories of the progressive movement in the United States are on the books. The bureaucracy is formally meritocratic. Business regulation, we have SEBI, we have competition commissions. Corporate governance reforms are very much back on the agenda. And of course, widespread social provisioning. Minimum wages, lots of spending on poverty program, rights to work, food, and so on. And the electorate is more than willing to, as they, in a technical political term, throw the rascals out. So this is an apparent paradox. Why does India still seem to be stuck in this system despite these extensive state and associated rights? There's a short answer from Fukuyama, which is that India is a clientelistic democracy, so it's stuck. You can't do anything. It's in Italy, Greece, Mexico. I think the long answer is both complex. That's very troubling. Because Fukuyama would argue you need the strong state first, and then you can shift to his nirvana or the rule of law and productivity dynamics. But if that's the answer, that's really troubling. For Indonesia, not to mention the many other developing country democracies around the world. But I think the longer answer is much more complex and much more interesting. And here are some suggestions where I'll look today and beyond for reactions. The first, the much more extensive state has actually become the domain of capture and effective rent sharing. Of course, political finance is one central part of this, of which land deals are a very important and very effective instrument for underpinning this in each ways. We've seen the increasing overlap between businessmen and politicians, and criminals in politics who are, according to some standards, actually preferred by the electorates because they get things done. Second, what I put in inverted commas because I have a lot of friends, ex-students who are IAS officers. That's why I put in a failure of the bureaucratic system, if not necessarily of bureaucrats, that often in the nature of the political economic structure, they are subservient or complicit with politician deals. In order to function, they have to deliver the goods to the politicians. There has not been that transition to bureaucratic autonomy that was central to some of the major agencies in the United States. there's a straight lack of capacity. Milan Vaishnav and co-author has argued this, that just in terms of numbers, and any IAS officer or other officer will affirm that just getting things done with the resources they have is extraordinarily difficult, which is why the Indian state is pretty good at campaigns, but very bad at generalized service provision. That's the second view. Third view. The India popular reaction is different, in my hypothesis, to the progressive movement. That it's much more protective of interests that are partly created by the state, rather than building a social democratic vision with regulated capitalism. So if we think of farmer movements, very important in the United States in terms of anti-monopoly, part of that coalition. Here, much more about protecting the multiple subsidies in the system that are distorting their behavior. Resistance to eviction and exploitation in slums and forests is again a protective, a completely understandable and correct protective, but it's not a coalition for change. It's a protective of your part of, if somewhat poor part of the system. The interesting movement around anti-corruption of 2-3 years ago, I think it's a very nice analysis by Vinay Sitapati, which is 3 different elements of that coalition: the modernizer technocrats, the Gandhi group, and the third, which but with his thesis is a very unusual coming together, which was unlikely to be replicated. It came together because of the sheer shock at the size of the scams and some dynamism in the leadership, but was not a sustainable coalition. The media, largely captured by business and government, so the space for muckraking journalism is weak, and that thus some of the apparent victories, which are in inverted commas, but not a coordinating alliance to reconstruct the state. And even still unclear if, in coal especially, it was transformative in these domains. And the point, the Polanyi double movement is actually happening at the same time in India, and that's pretty hard to manage politically. Final point is electoral strategies. Distributive sharing is politically essential, but often there are pretty effective ways of winning an election without dealing with the underlying problems of the state. And the Delhi election is a really interesting example that absolutely there's a demand for better governance, as there was in the Modi election, but the focal point depends on what is the alternative, and the AAP is a really unresolved mixture between being very pro-accountability and actually very populist, even before you get to its problems around the internal party structure. So, I think I'll just leave you with an idea on Andhra Pradesh, because I want to have a lot of time for discussion. That if you look at the other side of the Andhra Pradesh case as an exemplar of the system, what we see in some of the classic programs around the Andhra Pradesh created and to some degree innovated around tertiary education for everybody below poverty line, or the Airo Yashu program of health insurance, again for everybody of BPL status, were brilliant pieces of both in terms of political dynamics and rent extraction in the thesis. We've still got to try and do some more careful work on this. But what those schemes did is first have a government program which hit a very politically popular domain, the aspiration for tertiary education and for better health, and usefully extended the BPL definition so it was almost universal, something like 80% were eligible. Secondly, it activated private responses to that, with private colleges, private health centres could be part of this. Thirdly, Many of those, and here we are still trying to dig into the data, were actually either owned by politicians or those that were connected were part of the system, and fourth, the state financed it. So you've got a wonderful circular system which is politically effective, rent extractive, and provided there's not, the fiscal doesn't fall apart, looks sustainable. So I'm going to skip over that for reasons of time, but I'll share this. So that's a thesis of where we are now. So what about where we are up to now? So what about prospects? And through this prism, was the 2014 quote, Modi election transformative? Bearing in mind that a big part of the political historian thesis in the US was that it was democracy and the ballot which was the central glue for underpinning the long progressive era transition. Well, let's look back to those billionaire numbers out of interest. And what we see is actually a boom in the billionaires, in 2015. There's just over 50 in 2013 and 2014, almost 90 in 2015. A lot of this driven by stock market valuations. What's actually interesting is, at least according to the numbers, a lot of these are coming up in pharma, consumer goods, IT, software, which actually aren't the classically rent-thick sectors, so there's possibly positive stuff coming on. 9 in real estate, but most people think that part of net worth is, that aspect of billionaires and real estate is severely underestimated. But this group has done pretty well. So, what can we say about that? Now, of course the verdict is out, but could argue that alongside the progressive changes, possibly 2G and coal, continued rhetoric on social provisioning, lots of stuff going on there, from sanitation to, I don't like the term jam, but anyway, ambivalence over MG and Rega, some financial reform, preparation, that there's a deep political risk aversion, which I would suggest is actually reflective of earlier interpretations of India's political economy, of Pranab Bardhan's account of a collective action problem for fundamental change, even going back to K.N. Raj's view of the political dependence on the intermediate classes, which we see in the persistence of many subsidies. We see in the state bank nexus, which is very central to the rent extraction and potential problems, and we see in land and infrastructure are major unresolved issues. And I'd even suggest that the cooperative federalism, which is at one level the moves there, which were actually based from the Finance Commission, is fine, substantially better than the centrally sponsored schemes, which was exemplars of a failure of top-down rule-based conditionality. But that only shifts the issue, especially as actually it's the states that are the more important domain for patronage and rent sharing. And unlike the United States, where the cities became very important domains of political economic transition, going through a kind of effective clientelistic machine politics, which was effective, brought people in and built the cities up, through to a reform movement for more efficient cities, more inclusive cities, that unlike the US, in large part because the cities are not, because of the failure to devolve to US cities, to Indian cities, that they're not even in what you might call the machine politics phase. With short-run developments problematic, here we see this fascinating contrast between, this is the Sensex, of course, this is the burst in the Sensex is part of why billionaire wealth is going up. In contrast to profits actually going down. So we've got a big mismatch between expectations and how this dynamic usually works. And this corporate debt going up, which I suggested is one manifestation of the rent-sharing nexus. And if you take your mind back briefly to those dramatic crises in the United States, that was also very much driven by debt overhangs that these wealthy corporate tycoons were very effective in extracting from the global bond markets, which they then basically reneged on. And a few lost a bit of money, but mostly it was the creditors who lost out, and financial crashes on the way, and the debtors continued to accumulate their wealth. Now, India, of course, has a central bank, and up to now has very much managed to avoid that, and that up to a point may persist. But as we know from all the central bank, the Reserve Bank's pronouncements, they're extremely worried about debt ratios, not only for avoiding a crisis, but also because that's a major constraint on any infrastructural expansion. So, to summarize, final view. First is that Gilded Age dynamics are at work in both India and the United States, with a structural difference in that with the more extensive state in India, that has become an important domain for action. But the parallel, I argue, is there. Second, the electorate is clearly seeking an alternative equilibrium. And I personally prefer the interpretation of the BJP victory as the electorate saying, we want some different governance. Especially with the concern over the high-level scams and the daily humiliations of dealing with the state, and indeed dealing with a more extensive state. Unlike the US progressive era, I would argue that there is neither the collective action nor cognitive maps of either social movements or the political class that is aligned with required change. And even more speculatively, what prospects? Short run, I'm relatively pessimistic, but it's completely ambiguous. We know society, economies in this kind of situation can have temporary bursts. Current configuration doesn't look so good, but I'm agnostic on that. I think the medium term looks really problematic, given the combination of Gilded Age structures and populist resolutions with substantial developmental risks, but with significant heterogeneity across states. Long-term reading of US history, I tend to feel optimistic that sooner or later there will be a coalition, a coalescence around different popular and political movements to demand the more dramatic, efficient changes to an effective state, efficient regulated capitalism, and social provisioning in India. That's all for today.